Hello, members. Welcome and good evening, one and all. I'm very pleased to join you from what's not quite a Californian evening in Essex, but it's actually not far off. Tasting American wines any time of year is lovely, but I have to say a couple of the wines that we've got this evening are particularly delicious in the sunshine. So if you have got sunny weather near you, then congratulations. Still in a jumper though. Thank you again to Mahesh, as always, who is behind the scenes this evening, always helping us out with the Q&A and the chat. As per usual, for those of you who've done sip size before, please let us know where you are and what you're drinking on the chat, and use the Q&A to ask questions. It just makes life a bit easier. If you are using the chat as well, please remember to hit to everyone. I've already noticed a couple of people have put host and panelist. If you do put host and panelist, that means unfortunately that only Mahesh and I can see, and your fellow members can't see where you are and what you're drinking. So without further ado, I'm going to get going this evening, and we're going to cover the wonderful, and I truly mean wonderful, wine growing world, I think is probably the best way to describe it, that is the US of A. As per the blurb in the sip size event page, sorry, I lost my words. As per the event page, we are going to cover the three main wine growing regions that produce sort of top quality wine in America. But I'm going to dabble, I'll dip in and out of a few places if I can. What I would say is that I've spotted a few of you opening Sonoma and Napa wines. We're going to talk more broadly about the USA, so I will touch on Sonoma and I will touch on Napa, but I'm going to do a whole other event on particularly Sonoma and Napa, as well as maybe a few other places I mentioned this evening. So if you feel hard done by the course of the evening, you'll have had delicious wine, I hope, but also you will have some other things to look forward to, and I'm sure you won't feel hard done by anyway. So pardon me, let's talk history. As many of you know, it's where I often like to start the sip size sessions. Two quite unusual things on your screen, but American wine history is a sort of unusual mix of long and very short. So what I mean by that is European settlers traveled to the United States of America in the 16th century, where they began making wine. But it's really important that the wine they were making then is very different to what is being made now. So before we get started, I need to just hit you straight on with some geeky stuff, but this is really important, particularly when you hear people talk about American wine. There's one misnomer that I always hear people say, which is they say, oh, American wine, isn't that like foxy? And people can be very disparaging about wines from the United States of America, but what they're actually confusing it with is American native grape varieties. So before we get started, that's what the little picture on the left is for, and I will explain to you why this is such an important part of the history of American viticulture. The grapes that are native to America are not Vitis vinifera. Vitis vinifera are the vines from Europe. And those grapes, pardon me, are things like your Chardonnays, your Cabernets. They're the species that we know and recognize. They come under the umbrella term Vitis vinifera. There are different vitis, so different types of grapevine that were originally from the USA. So Vitis riparia, Vitis rupestris, Vitis labrusca. You don't hear these names, and quite rightly you shouldn't, because that's the Latin. Why would you know? You can still find those grape varieties, but they are rare and they're not deemed to be internationally of high quality, and they are not the same as Chardonnay grown in the USA. We're talking about two different species here. So European vines, Vitis vinifera, when the settlers tried to take those European vines, so let's say I am a settler from Italy and I am taking some of my Garganega, so Soave grape variety, for example. We're talking about Italian, Spanish, French, lots of settlers came in the 16th century. Say I'm taking my Italian varieties over, my Vitis vinifera variety. When people tried to plant these grapes, when the settlers tried, they kept finding they were dying. The reason they were dying is because Vitis vinifera, the European species, is susceptible to this lovely, beautiful little thing on the left-hand side of your screen. This is a microscopic louse, and it carries a disease with it called phylloxera. Well, it's a phylloxera louse. Now, this louse is present in American soils, or was present in those days. And so the American species of vines, your Vitis riparia, were used to it. They got used to it. When they tried to plant things like your Chardonnays, your French varieties, Spanish, Italian, they were literally being eaten alive. These little aphids, these little lice, were eating the roots of the vines. So they could not, I'm just going to stop sharing for a moment, they could not plant these European varieties. Even Thomas Jefferson tried to plant French varieties and failed. Nobody could work out what was going on, but they just kept failing. So instead, they went back to the native varieties, these things like the Vitis riparia. There's one variety in particular they planted a lot of called Concord, which you can sometimes hear about. But then the Spanish missionaries discovered the very dry, the very sandy soils of New Mexico in the 1600s. And these Spanish missionaries suddenly found out that this, well, they didn't know at the time, it's worth saying that, but this louse could not live in the sandy soils. So they plant the first successful Vitis vinifera vines in the whole of the United States. And they use Spanish missionaries, and they use the grape variety Mission. So Mission, brought over from Spain, becomes the first European variety in the 1600s to be successful. Slowly, and I do mean quite slowly, vines travel up the coast and they get to California about the late 1760s. Ooh, sorry, let me turn my laptop dinger off, otherwise that will annoy everybody. And that was around the San Diego area. And they didn't even get to Napa until the 1800s. So sometime in the 1830s, vines reached Napa. So how have we got around this problem of this little bug? Well, actually, we didn't get around the problem. We made the problem worse. The louse, phylloxera, spread all around the world, and I'm sure many of you wine buffs will already know about it, but it spread all around the world, which created a bigger problem. Now, everywhere had the louse problem, and we basically transported an American issue to Europe. But in doing that problem, what happened was a lot of research went into how to solve it. And one of the ways to solve it is by grafting vines. So we have American rootstocks that are happy living with the louse, and then European grafts or scions put onto the top. So at last, we have a solution. So not only can that happen in Europe, where the problem is absolutely escalating, but in that late 1890s, after the problem went wild, in the early 1900s, we now have a solution for growing European varieties successfully all over the USA. But it wasn't all roses, and it's worth saying that. And why wasn't it all roses? Well, we have a few things go wrong. We have World War I. We have World War II. We have the Great Depression. We have, here on the right, Prohibition. So quite frankly, if you have had a vine or a plant material, but particularly a vine, survive 2 world wars, a depression where everything was being pulled out, and an illegal entire ban on the production of alcohol for sale, if you've survived all of that, then it's nothing short of a miracle, in my opinion. So although it has a very colourful past, it has, I think, one of the most interesting pasts of any wine growing country in the world. But from hard times, we've sprung back. And today, every single state produces wine. Although over half of the wine produced, over half of the wineries, nearly 10,000 wineries are based in California. And about 80% of the wine produced in all of the US is produced in California. That used to be about 90%. And at some point, it was about 95%. But every single state does now produce wine. And to top it off, the top 10 varieties produced, I've gone to the producing states. I'll tell you that in a second. The top 10 varieties produced are actually all European varieties. There might be one you don't recognize, which is Ruby Red, and that is a crossing, which strangely enough is now actually very highly planted in South Africa as well. But hopefully you recognize all the others. So we'll talk about those in a second. But let's just quickly touch on the states. California, 84%-ish at the moment. It does go up and down. Washington, we're going to talk about today. New York, I will quickly mention, we haven't got much time because we're going to focus on the West Coast today. So we're going to miss New York and Pennsylvania. New York, we very, very rarely sell any wine from New York, and that's just sadly because it's very expensive. But if I just show you whereabouts it is, New York State we're talking about here. It's a wine region basically focused around the Finger Lakes, and the Finger Lakes are these incredibly deep lakes, and those lakes regulate the temperature, so the very cool climate is moderated. What it does mean is it's still cool climate. You get a lot of snow in the winter, but it's not as aggressive because if you plant your vines around the water, it sort of eases the extreme peaks. But you get very good quality white wine up here in New York State, but it is quite expensive. So we tend not to sell too much of it. It's really, really premium in the UK, but it can be found. And then Pennsylvania, not as high a quality growing region. So we're not going to talk about that today. We are going to touch on Oregon, even though we don't have an Oregon wine to taste, because I tried to keep everything affordable. And as I will explain shortly, Oregon is not the most affordable place. So we're going to start off in Washington. We're going to start off in Washington because it's the second largest state. It's also our lovely, it's our lovely Riesling. So please get tasting, members. Definitely get tasting. It's 10 minutes in. I bet you're thirsty. But we are going to hopefully quite elegantly move from north to south in this tasting. So Washington is in the north, and it's the northernmost wine producing region in the US of A, or state, I should say. It's the second largest growing region, and it's the second largest production region. 19 AVAs in total. And as you can see, this is where it gets a bit confusing. You can see the state line between Oregon here. There are quite a few AVAs that actually spread across Washington and Oregon. I've got some on the maps I'll show you later, which can get a tad confusing, but because they are more assimilated to the Washington region, and quite frankly, even though the state boundary is here, they don't really align with the Oregon growing region. They're considered Washington, so quite confusing. But this is the map of Washington State. There is one large sort of overarching famous AVA, which is Columbia Valley, which is where we're tasting from this evening. And that almost basically, if you see the pale orange color, it encompasses the whole area. Very clever, because not only are you tasting wine from Washington, Columbia Valley has now got a kind of quality cachet to it as well. People are starting to recognize Columbia Valley. It allows different regions to be blended together, as well as the outside sort of non-named areas. But what they call it in the US, these AVAs, so these viticultural areas, they call them nested AVAs. So that's when you've got an AVA within an AVA. So the most famous of those nested, i.e. you could kind of think of it like a crude tree, but I wouldn't, it gets a bit complicated. But the most famous is probably Walla Walla. And that particularly is famous for its Syrah. But Washington has got a bit of an identity crisis in terms of which red grape it wants to hero. It just happens to be that the Syrah from Walla Walla is so fantastic that it's probably the most famous, that has become the calling card of that appellation, or that AVA. So what makes the growing conditions so interesting about Washington? Well, and please start tasting. I want you to sort of, if you have the Washington wine, of course, but if not, please taste anything you like. I saw a Dominus earlier, which I would certainly like a glass of, but alas. So Washington, there are really the perfect climatic conditions for growing grapes here. It shares a latitude with some of the most famous wine regions in the world. So it basically straddles between the Burgundy and the Rhone, and arguably kind of the Alto Adige, northern Italian regions. You could add a push some other regions up there, but it's the 46th parallel. So it's got this, as they say here, sweet spot. Oh, I put this in to show you the mountain ranges here, because this is where it gets, in my opinion, really interesting. If you're a fan of Alsatian wine, and that's why I kind of like that they grow the Alsatian varieties, because it tells my story well. But if you're a fan of Alsatian wine, you may have heard me talk or someone talk in the past about a rain cloud about the Vosges Mountains. The same experience is happening in Washington State. If you consider how far north this is, Washington State should be too cold, arguably sometimes, and probably too wet, considering that it's right next to the Pacific Ocean. If anybody's ever been on holiday to Seattle, which I must admit I haven't, but it's, you know, you see in all the films, it is always raining. It's a very, very wet place. What is happening is the rain is coming in from the Pacific. It's falling on the Olympic Mountains and Seattle, and this one AVA here, Puget Sound, which actually is a very wet AVA. But then the clouds continue over the Cascade Mountains, and they really do finish there. So what happens here is the rest of Washington State becomes almost like a desert. It has to be seen to be believed. It only gets 6 to 8 inches of rainfall per year. So we've got low rainfall, we've got a nice latitude, so a cool climate growing region, but not too cold, not too hot, a bit Goldilocks. But the other lovely thing here is we've got loads of sunshine. Because of the northerly region, we have 2 more hours sunshine than California per day in the growing season. But we have that cooling influence of the latitude and large diurnal shifts, so really cool evenings. So actually we end up with this sort of very lucrative, high volume, but high quality region that can produce entry-level wines and fine wines. And it's a very, very attractive place to grow grapes. So I've just got a few stats here I pulled from the Washington the Washington sort of Association of Wine, but over 1,000 wineries now. And then that's why I really wanted to pull that one out, because the wine that we're tasting today, the Chateau Saint Michel, was one of the original established wineries. When they were established in only 1967, so very, very recently, there were only 10 wineries in the whole state. They were one of 10, and there are now over 1,000, making $8 billion of economic impact. So they've come on a long way. Final quick slide before I really go into the wine, and then we'll move through the others a bit more quickly. But I find Washington fascinating. It's got a really broad range of grape varieties. I mentioned it had a bit of an identity crisis. At one point, they really heroed Merlot because Napa was heroing Cabernet, so they decided to go with Merlot. But after the film Sideways, which I'm sure some of you will have seen, after the film Sideways, the attitudes to Merlot changed, and a lot of people thought it was a mediocre wine, which you're very welcome to tell that to the producers of Pomerol and Saint-Emilion. But anyway, Merlot has since declined, which is a bit of a shame because the Merlot here can be world class. But as you can see, there's some lovely focus on Riesling. I mentioned Alsatian varieties. And that's what we've got in the glass today, because I think it's a lovely calling card, and there's very, very few parts of America, more Canada, but they're better in Canada and New York, but there's very few parts of West Coast America that can produce Riesling of this style. So let's talk about it. I've had somebody mention in the Q&A or the chat already about the reviews on this wine. I think the problem with the reviews on this wine is it's not what you expect. So this wine might surprise you if you're tasting along. It is a very obscure combination for me of the fruit forwardness of what you would sort of expect of an American expression of anything. But it's in a medium dry style, even though the nose is very kind of lemongrass, as Sarah has mentioned here. It's lemon and limey on the nose, and you're kind of expecting it to be very dry and high acid, perhaps. And in Alsace, you would probably ferment this to dryness. But what they've done here is they've kind of taken a bit of a mixture of an approach, and they've made it in a medium dry style that for me is more like a beefed up German version of a medium dry Riesling. It is such a pleasure to drink this wine with a stir fry. I know Sarah's mentioned it in her tasting note, but I can't mention it enough. We have used this wine recently in a Thai and I think a Chinese tasting online and in person, because there are very few wines, I think, that really have enough weight and enough flavour. It's a very, very flavourful Riesling. Unoaked, as I mentioned, medium dry style. And Chateau Saint Michel, having gone from being one of the originals, now owns over a third of the entire vineyard area of Washington state. So they are a big, big operation, which is one of the reasons that you can buy a Riesling from Washington for under £10. The other lovely thing is that it's on its own rootstocks. One of the reasons is that very, very dry desert-like area I mentioned, because of not just the soils, which are sandy, but also the climate being so dry. That lousy louse doesn't like it. So these are actually on their own rootstock as well. They don't have to graft these. So have a taste, and then we're going to move down to Oregon. So it has still got that classic Riesling acidity, but it's not a sort of very, very linear, sharp acidity, because that little residual sugar and the real richness of the fruit is softening it out slightly. I find the balance really, really pleasant in this wine. I just think the medium off-dry examples, perhaps not what people were expecting. And I think that's genuinely why some of the reviews are a little lackluster. So let's go into Oregon. Now, we're not going to focus on Oregon because we don't have a wine. Now, the reason is this is an intro session, not a focus on session. I will do a focus on Oregon. I love it, but we need to spend a lot more in order to get a good selection of Oregon wines. I'm going to show you two of my favorites in a minute. So yeah, don't panic. Oregon will come back, and it will particularly come back because it's the heartland of Pinot Noir, which outside Burgundy, I don't think there's anywhere else in the world that grows better Pinot Noir than Oregon, and lots of people would say the same. So I won't dwell on it too much and make us all jealous, but I will say it was another late blooming region relatively, but it found its identity very quickly. Unlike Washington state, slight identity crisis, Oregon is the home of Pinot Noir. The Willamette Valley, the Willamette Valley, which is this area here. Willamette Valley is probably the most famous area. It's top quality Pinot Noir. And again, we've got lots of nested AVAs up here around the Portland area. But I will just give you a quick history, and I'm going to be very quick on Oregon. A gentleman called David Lett, who was the founder of Erie Vineyards, who we do sell their wines. I'm going to show you one in a second on the screen. They call him Papa Pinot. And in 1965, he was at UC Davis, California, the wine university, and he said, I want to plant Pinot Noir in Oregon. And they said, it's too cold and it's too wet. And he said, I'm doing it. So he planted Pinot Noir, and he planted Pinot Blanc. And after he planted those two grape varieties, Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris, not Pinot Blanc. So he planted those in the mid 60s. In 1975, he came in the top 10 Pinot Noirs in the world in the sort of wine Olympics, and caught the eye of the very famous Burgundy producer, Robert Drouhin, who asked him for a rematch, which he did. I think it was something like 1/10 of a point behind the Burgundy winner, Roberts. And after that, not long after that, Domaine Drouhin of Oregon was born. So immediately in the 1970s, the Burgundy producers knew that they were in for something here, and there are plenty of Burgundian producers that are also set up in Oregon. So I mentioned Willamette Valley. It's got 9 little AVAs nestled within it, and then there's Southern Oregon that has 5 within that. The focus here is on quality. Even though they make 1.5% of the wines of the entire of the USA, often around a fifth of all of the top point scorers, everything over 90 points, often about a fifth will be from Oregon. So you can't really find those entry level price points. So it's quite tricky when you're doing a sip size event. When we're doing our next focus on, we'll do it. But I thought, in the interests of being kind, I would show you 2 examples that I absolutely love. So there's the Pinot Noir from the Erie Vineyards, David Lett, and then there's also the Bergstrom Chardonnay. Top varieties are Pinot Noir, Pinot Gris, Chardonnay, Riesling, and Cabernet. Arguably and I hear this all the time, the Chardonnay, they should plant more of it because it is absolutely fantastic as well. But Pinot Noir, by a long way, is the top variety in Oregon. So let's get to the meat on the bones, because we've got 20 minutes to talk California, which is nearly impossible, but we're going to try our best. So this is the Californian grape growing area. Reported acreage is nearly 500,000 acres, so 460,000 and something. And we're actually seeing a decreasing trend in the area of vines. And you may be surprised, or perhaps not surprised, to hear why that is. And okay, it's not a huge shift, but there is a shift for growing marijuana in California since the laws have changed, and you need two very similar skilled workers to tend marijuana plants and vines, and also a lot of there's just a lot of crossover. It's a fascinating subject. Now I'm going to briefly mention Napa and Sonoma because we must, and I'll just literally one line on Mendocino before I start. Mendocino is the kind of, well, most northerly, you'd have some discussion up here, but most northerly recognized region, very famous sparkling wine from Mendocino. And then we've got Napa and Sonoma. Now, I've intentionally excluded them in much detail. Like I said, it's a rabbit hole, and we're going to go into those two well-known premium regions in a focus on as well. So we'll do Oregon and we'll do Napa and Sonoma. But I will touch on Napa Cabernet because I think to not mention it in this would be completely remiss. Napa is dominated by Cabernet. It's almost monovarietal, almost, to its benefits and perhaps to its losses. Napa is where the most expensive wines in the USA come from. There are some exceptions, of course there are, but the majority of the expensive ones are coming from Napa. And they are Cabernet Sauvignon or Cabernet based blends. So there was a gentleman, well, excuse me if it wasn't a gentleman, someone earlier drinking the Dominus. You get Dominus, Ridge, all of these recognizable, beautiful wines. I had Stony Hill last night at a tasting in London. Fabulous wines. They are dry, rich, and full-fruited Cabernets. They tended to be quite high in alcohol. That's pulling back a bit. They're not quite as high as they used to be. Better management in the vineyard and all sorts of things. And what you should expect from those wines are things like blackberry, blackcurrant, a bit of toasty oak. The cooler sites sometimes have the bell pepper thing, but less and less so with climate change. The alcohol sometimes, more often than not, higher than Bordeaux, but does not have to be. You don't have to be at 15%. There are sort of benches on the Napa mountainside, and those benches have the better soils running alongside the ridges almost. And they're also slightly elevated, so they can have a bit cooler climate. But for me, fundamentally, the telltale sign of what is an amazing Cabernet versus what is an amazing Bordeaux is the richness of the fruit. Cabernet from Napa. A Napa Cabernet for me always tastes fruitier. There is always that kind of like juicy thing going on that I think that Bordeaux, doesn't get the right climate, the right growing conditions. Napa Cabernet can age 5 years minimum, but most will easily age over 20 if they're the good stuff. So I had to throw in a Napa Cabernet and I had to talk about it, but I really want to spend a lot of time on it on another session. So I'm going to talk more about Californian Chardonnay because we have a Californian Chardonnay. But this gives you an idea, just whilst we're getting our wine ready, of the states in which the top wine producing states. So it would be completely remiss for me to not talk about Napa. You'll notice that the wines that I'm tasting today actually don't feature on here. There is a reason. The states that we're tasting are the more affordable, perhaps less known, you could argue, but equally they're not I'm about to be really nasty, wine lakes. Because one of the things about California, let me go back to the map, is you almost, and I'm going to go on to this in a minute once we taste this wine, but you must remember that California quality is almost in bands by taken not horizontally but vertically, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So let's talk about Wente and let's talk about Livermore. I've just forgotten to show you where Livermore is. Shame on me. Livermore is just here. So it's just beneath Sonoma and Napa, and that's why I've chosen it. It's almost Sonoma and Napa in style, or Sonoma in particular, but it's a little more affordable, shall we say, coming from just down beneath in the Central Coast. And it's a lovely wine. In Livermore, grapes were first planted in the... just stop sharing for just a moment. Grapes were first planted in Livermore in the 1840s, so slightly older than the regions we've just been talking about. It was also the first place in the whole of California to label Chardonnay, literally on the label, which sounds completely mad. And the same with Petit Syrah and Sauvignon Blanc. So it was very forward thinking and telling people what was in the bottle. That wasn't done before. If you were in France, you labeled by region, you didn't say what the grape was. 80% of Californian Chardonnay, of the whole of California, can be traced back to the Livermore Valley plantings, which I think is incredible. So it really is the epicenter of Chardonnay. There's about 2,000 hectares of vineyards here, so it's sizable, it's not huge. And it's a beautiful little bowl. So it's about 25 miles long and 18 miles wide, this lovely bowl. And importantly, it has an east-west orientation. And I'm about to explain why that is so important, not just for Livermore, but for Napa, for Sonoma, for Santa Barbara, for all of these places that you hear about. I'm going to explain why the east-west orientation is crucial. But I'll quickly tell you about the wine so you can taste whilst you learn about some geography, or geology, I should say. So I'll tell you about the fog in a sec, the geology part. But in terms of winemaking, this was 50% fermented in barrel, neutral American oak, and then 50% stainless steel. It was then partly barrel aged for on its lees for 9 months. So what you're getting there is this incredible richness of aromas, so that vanilla and spice coming from the barrel. And then when you taste it as well, you should have some richness coming through, not from just the barrel, but they also did batonnage, so they stirred in those lees, and they did that once a month. So you'll get texture from the lees too. Maybe when I get lees aged Chardonnays, I tend to get something ever so slightly salty as well. Or maybe not salty in this wine in particular, but a kind of slight savory touch, which is really scrummy. So have a taste. Again, it's very fruity compared to European styles. So I can taste apples, I can taste pears. I'm not sort of saying, light citrus fruits. I'm being hit by the fruits. I'm being hit by that vanilla and that spice. But what I would say here, and this is why I want you to taste along whilst I'm talking about it, I can taste the evidence that this wine has had a cooling influence. And I'm not crazy. It has had a cooling influence, which I'm going to talk about now as I show you the map again. But it is one of the reasons that quality wine growing in California is on this side here. Now, how can I taste the cooling influence in the wine? I taste it by that sort of backbone of acidity. It's not flabby, it's not fat. It's got this kind of crispness and this freshness. It's not an acidity that makes you go zing, but it's an acidity that really refreshes the mouth. Considering that you've got all of those beautiful, powerful flavors, I still feel refreshed. I can still feel myself salivating. Now, Chardonnay isn't naturally the most high acid wine compared to Riesling from before. So it's really important that acidity that is there, you need to keep it preserved, especially when it's been getting a suntan on the coast of California. So let me explain why. California's wine regions are defined not by longitude almost, but latitude. So the cooler you are, the closer you are to the cooling ocean breezes and fogs, the better the structure of your wine tends to be, because those cooling influences help your grape retain acidity. So what you can sort of do sometimes is actually work from the outside in. Now, there is an argument that's not quite true, because this is the Sierra foothills. So the cooling influence starts up again here. In this yellow bit, the Sierra foothills, if you are actually in the foothills, those grapes have the advantage of altitude. So they're being cooled by a different reason. This big blue bit here, Inland Valley, or sometimes down here called Central Valley, those are Much warmer, flatter plains, and they are almost trapped by little mountains that sort of come here, and they don't get the cooling breezes of the fog. So this is where you get your kind of California blend wines. It's very easy to grow grapes so long as you irrigate, because there's not much rain. You irrigate, you can get them really ripe easily. You might pick them a bit early in order to get them not so jammy, but you can produce grapes very easily here. They call it the salad bowl of America because everything grows. You can't stop it growing. But what you have here in the Central Coast and North Coast in particular is you have Pacific cooling influence. Now, here by San Francisco, you have a really strong influence of something called the San Pablo Bay. And this is where Sonoma and Napa get their cooling breezes and that very, very famous fog. It's also where our Livermore region gets the cooling breezes. And I mentioned earlier the orientation being from east to west. That is the crucial factor because it's very similar to Chile in this sense. If you have east to west mountain ranges rather than the mountains that block the fog and the wind, if your mountains are running this way, you have channels that fog can go through. I've actually got a photo. This is Napa, but it just shows you the fog it comes in every morning. It cools those grapes down. If they're starting to get a little warm, it's like air conditioning. It just cools them down in the morning, and then by the afternoon there's mists or fogs, I should say, clear. I will mention, because we're going north to south, and I know that we're going to go into Lodi, and I'm going to talk about why you don't want too much cooling influence here in a moment. But I should just point out a couple of other points, because two particular places for me of huge interest are Paso Robles. Again, they get the fog there. We've got great oriented mountain ranges, but have got a bit of altitude as well, and it's very near the coast. Great for Rhone varieties. So if you like your Rhone wines, Paso Robles, they've just had a consortium of Rhone producers go over to Paso this week and present their wines. And Santa Barbara. Now, contrary to what you might believe, Santa Barbara, even though it is the most southerly, or closest to the equator, Santa Barbara is the coldest region in the whole of whole of California. It's the breezes. I have stood in Santa Barbara physically shaking in September because I've been so cold, because we drove up from LA where it was absolutely baking, and I was in a t-shirt, and I got into the hills of Santa Barbara, which like vacuum up this cold fog, and I was absolutely frozen. So I can attest to them. So we're going to now talk about Lodi. And Lodi, sorry, I moved on too quickly. Lodi is this little, it's actually this little teeny, it's not teeny tiny at all, but it looks teeny tiny on the map. It's this lovely flat plain that sounds like it should produce the really cheap and cheerful, gorgeous, everyday drinking wines. And instead it produces this intense, rich, beautiful Zinfandel, amongst other things, but it's the Zinfandel I want to talk to you about. So it's a relatively young AVA, recognized in the 1980s. When I went on my first tasting around California, I didn't really think very much of Lodi. I thought, well, it's in that middle section, and everyone says that section's the sort of everyday stuff. And it's 90 miles from San Francisco Bay, so it's not going to have that much influence. And it's one of the largest regions. There's 125 varieties, so maybe it doesn't have much identity. Is it too diverse? And then I discovered the gem that is Old Vine Zinfandel. So the soils here in Lodi are very sandy, or there are certainly large pockets of sand. It was a real area of the gold rush, so lots of settlers were there about 200 years ago. So because of that, the vines in Lodi are some of the oldest in the whole of the United States. Now, I didn't take this photo, but believe me, I have many photos of old vine Zinfandel that look like this, because it is fascinating. You have these gnarled old vines that the bottle, if you're drinking the Brazen tonight, that's what the gnarled vine is on the label. It is a lovely old vine Zinfandel. Now, old vine in the US technically has to be over 35 years old. The vines that produce the Brazen are much older. They haven't got an exact date, but I think 60 to 80 is the average. So why is this important? Well, the vines are still on their original roots, so some of them 200 years plus old. And it thrived in this lovely warm climate. You know, people who shipped their grapes over from Europe planted Zinfandel. It thrived in the Prohibition because nobody needed to tend them particularly. These old vines look after themselves, and they're incredible. But where are they from? And this is what I love about Zinfandel. There's this incredible sort of story, and every grape has some DNA story, but I have to say Zinfandel's for me is the most fascinating. And I probably will do a whole session on Zinfandel, but I can give you the praised version. So after Prohibition, nobody had pulled it out. I mentioned at the beginning, if you can survive 2 world wars, you know, a Great Depression, etc., Prohibition, then you're doing pretty well, and phylloxera. And these vines have done that. So people then started saying, well, what is Zinfandel? We're a bit confused. They originally thought it was Primitivo, so from the south of Italy, from Puglia. They did some DNA testing and they thought, well, it's very similar, but I'm going to bust a myth because most people say it's Primitivo, and it's actually not. They are very closely related, but it is not, because once they established that Zinfandel / Primitivo, they knew there was some DNA match with a Croatian variety called Plavac Mali. So a professor from UC Davis and some Croatian viticulturalists said, okay, right, so it's not Italian. We've worked that out. We think it might be Croatian, but we're not really sure. Let's go and have a look around Croatia. And they have found the grape variety Crnac Kaštelanski. Crnac Kaštelanski. I have to say it quickly to get it right. Crnac Kaštelanski. Yes. And it has been genetically matched to Zinfandel. So it's actually the Croatian settlers that brought this grape variety. And it makes sense because it has lasted in this very hot, arid climate. But unlike the, dare I say, Merlot of Lodi, which I wouldn't personally go near, or white grapes, no. This is a grape that came from somewhere very hot and sandy and thrives somewhere very hot and sandy. So if you haven't already tucked in, please do. It is full-bodied. It's rich, it's unctuous. It's not supposed to be a wimpy wine. The older vines are going to concentrate the flavor as well. So the older the vine, the more concentrated generally the flavors in the wine will come. It's had some oak, so there's a bit of smokiness I get from the oak, but Zinfandel, I love. I think Sarah's note, does it say Black Forest Gatto? I'm just going to remind myself and let members read. Yes, Black Forest Gatto. That to me is when beautiful kind of red berry wines have been oaked well. You get this mocha, blueberry, blackberry, chocolatey, almost bordering on espresso nose. But it has this beautiful sweet touch of vanilla as well. So have a taste. It's definitely not wimpy. The nice thing about Zinfandel for me is that it can retain the acidity, so I've still got some freshness, and the tannins are quite supple and quite soft, so you can drink Zinfandel when it's quite young, relatively young. So we're drinking a 2019. For me, that's a real bonus. You don't have to hang on to these wines. And the fruits are lovely and juicy, but it's got this kind of sweetness and this friendliness that just adds to that level of juice and sweetness. So it's kind of just, I know what my colleague Emma Briffett would call this. She'd call this a cuddle in a glass. And for me, that's exactly what it is. It's just happiness. And you don't have to overthink it. And you don't have to spend a fortune on it either. There are some producers making high-end old vine Zinfandel, and they are delicious. But you don't have to spend a fortune to get amazing old vine Zinfandel. And this is a prime example for me of really, really good value stuff. So I will mention, actually I shouldn't. I'll just say now that Zinfandels did quite well in our Wine Champions tasting recently. They were a real pleasure to taste. Everyone on the sort of alternative European styles tasting said that Zinfandel was one of the absolute highlights as a grape variety. So real quality stuff coming from the USA. I've got a few questions about the Zin coming in, so I'll quickly jump on those. Is the vanilla of the Brazen coming from the oak? New, old, American? So Andrew, in answer to your question, the vanilla is coming from oak. Now it is American oak. Annoyingly, I haven't got how long, but it's American and French. Now you can get vanilla or the vanillin flavor from French as well as American oak. But the American tends to be sort of more that sweet vanilla essence for me, and the French tends to be fresh vanilla pods. So yeah, let me know what you think, which one you think is coming through more, but it's a combination of both of them. And yes, definitely quite a portion of new in order to impart that flavor. Where would I recommend Merlot from? Wente or Livermore? It's a question from Simon. So Merlot, both Wente and Livermore are delicious. I would say basically Merlot, the best areas for Merlot are those kind of north of the not central coast, sorry, I'll show you on the map. Don't go much lower. This is what I was going to say. Don't go much lower geographically than Livermore. There's actually not much produced in Santa Barbara or San Luis Obispo or Paso anyway. So you want to stay in your Sonoma, Napa if you really want high-end stuff, but Livermore is absolutely delicious as well. I wouldn't go into Lodi, etc. either. Sorry, I've jumped straight into questions without really finishing that tasting, but we had a few coming through on the Zin, because I had another one which was what would you pair with the old vine Zinfandel, and another person asking about barbecues, and I'm going to combine them because for me the old vine Zinfandel is the perfect burger barbecue. Sweet ribs. So even though there's not actually sugar in this wine, it's got the perception of sweetness. And you know, when you get those sticky American style ribs, or even actually Chinese ribs that love that sticky, gooey flavor, for me, Zinfandel is just an absolute no-brainer. And then in terms of vegetarian dishes, you're going to really have to get something meaty and powerful. Again, I would find some Chinese flavors work very well. There's a touch of spice. So that kind of umami but with sweetness. So if you're making anything with a sort of soy and honey glaze, those sorts of things are delicious. I know that goes really well with aubergines and miso and those sorts of flavors on an aubergine, so that's where I'd head to with that. Right, so I apologize. I got carried away by the questions on the Zinfandel because I just love it. So it's a really fun wine. Don't take it too seriously. There are more serious Zinfandels in the world, but this is just a delicious one. So let's go on to talking talking about the range of questions that you've sent through. I've already seen that there are a few. I've had a question in from Peter Cousins, which says about, can you explain the color coding of the map? Yes, I can, since it's up, that makes sense. So literally what you can see here is yellow is the Sierra foothills I mentioned earlier. I might be going over this twice, but obviously the Sierra foothills being literally the start of Yosemite National Park. This is where all the Californians go skiing. It gets cold up there. So these are the sort of foothills. Obviously, the closer you get to the blue line, those are going to be flatter. So you really want to be up in the proper Sierra foothills. This section is called, on this map, the inland valleys. Oh, the main USA map. Peter, let me know if you mean the main USA map or this map. I think you might mean the main USA map. I think you're right. I apologize. I thought this was quite self-explanatory. I'll just zoom back to the main USA map then and have a look. I don't think there is a color coding. No, there isn't. So this is just by state. So they've just tried to differentiate the colors by state. So just to make it less confusing. I'm not necessarily sure that that it is. But for example, Texas is all blue, Oklahoma's pink. They have missed, obviously, states. So there is wine grown in Nebraska. There's wine grown everywhere. There's actually lots of wine grown in Michigan at the moment, which is interesting. There's wine grown everywhere. I think the dot is trying to just show the main region. Obviously, it would be an enormously changing, ever-changing map if we were to do it. So there's no color coding. It's just to show the different states. Whilst we're on that point, though, because it did kind of crop up when we talked about Washington and Oregon, the way that the USA has historically done their AVAs. So when they first put the AVAs in place, a lot of them were very much defined by kind of county lines rather than a terroir driven approach. And even now, I would say that more places are defining their terroir by their climate rather than their soils. Now, that's not exclusively true. And if you speak to a Napa winemaker, they'd say we've got more soils than the whole of France put together and those sorts of things. And there's definitely evidence of lots of soil types. But you'll find a lot of the boundaries are lineated by exactly state lines, what different states can do. This is a major exception where we have some hangover and some crossover. And also there's another, you'll see this yellow dot, Idaho actually crosses into Oregon and a little bit of their wine growing. But there's a lot of sort of regimented state lines in the US that make AVAs, which is, oh, thank you, John, American Viticultural Area. It's like a appellation or a designated area for grape growing. Can make grape growing quite complicated in the US because you don't necessarily know whether one AVA is going to be better. You might find that one AVA literally just stops because that's where the state line is, as opposed to where the soil continues or where the climate is the same. So AVA system in America is fine-tuning itself at the moment. And that's why we're seeing those things like, as I mentioned, nested AVAs, where originally they said, here's the AVA for this entire section. And now they're starting to work out, well, hold on. Paso Robles is a great example. Paso Robles just basically had its own big AVA. And now in Paso, slowly by slowly, they're saying, hey, no. This place has completely different soil. The soil here is red. This place has this. So it's quite interesting watching the AVA system develop in the USA. And another point I will make is that to declare your wine as AVA anything in America, it's only got to be 85% of that grape variety. So if you have a Californian Cabernet, it might only be 85%. You might have Merlot in there, you might have Cabernet Franc, you might have all sorts of things. So the rules are very different to Europe. Europe is similar, actually, the European Union, but America certainly champions that kind of 85% rule. So sometimes you'll find producers say on the front label Cabernet Sauvignon, and on the back they'll say with 5% Merlot, and they're quite honest about it. We can't go into it right now as well, but the system to sell wine in the USA is just mad. There's a 3-tier system. It's quite complicated, but we won't go into it. It's the sort of thing you need a whole case of wine to really enjoy. But anyway, I'll go back to a couple more questions. We don't have any Croatian wines varieties at the moment, but we will pass that on to Freddie and Matthew. Croatian wines are very interesting. And although I don't know if we'll get any Croatian Zinfandel, I don't know how much is made anymore. It's a very obscure original grape variety, but we'll pass that on. James has asked a fantastic question. If Zin was a celebrity, which celebrity would she be? I'm going to go with Dawn French. You've really put me on the spot. Zinfandel is known for being friendly, fun, bubbly, chatty, kind of, the life and soul of the party, but can be serious when wanted. And I think as an actress, maybe Dawn French does that for me. Yeah, there we go. An unusual question with an unusual answer. Now, do you think there is a premium to Californian wines generally, from Sarah? That's a great question, Sarah. I think I wouldn't say there's a premium that the producers put on. I think by the nature of how they're sold and how they get to us, we would pay more for Californian wines than I would like, by the time we get to them with taxes. That being said, we've just demonstrated that you can still get amazing quality for under £15. And I think one of the reasons that is the case is the growing conditions are very favorable to growing wine. So vintage variation that we see in Europe, that means that prices have to be sometimes overinflated in order to mitigate against risk for frost, etc. Burgundy there's a sort of cycle going on in Burgundy at the moment where they're having to put prices up if they've had a bad frost year, and then those prices retain even if they have a good year, and then the next frost year they sort of go up. You don't really get that in places like California. There is such consistency, with the exception of forest fires. There has historically been such consistency, they just don't need to do that. So there's not this price inflation that we might see happening in other premium regions in the world. But there certainly is, unfortunately, that extra bit that is added if we want to consume these wines in the UK. If you go to California, you can drink a lot of these wines more affordably by the glass in restaurants, and it's absolutely amazing. And you don't even have to go to the wine regions to do it. Go to an amazing bar in San Francisco and drink your way through most of California, and it's incredible. But yes, there's a small extra bit that naturally we have to pay, also the shipping of them, labor costs, etc., generally more than other places in producing wine in younger regions like Chile, Argentina, etc. But they don't have to actually technically overinflate their prices, no. David Peacock, and I haven't mentioned this because we didn't really go into Sideways, but I think it would be nice to quickly talk about Sideways. If anyone hasn't seen it, David Peacock has asked, are there any still any outstanding California Merlots stocked by the Wine Society, or did Sideways smash them all to pieces? Oh, what a wonderful question. David, there are plenty of amazing Californian generally Merlots. Sideways, I mentioned earlier, the film. If you haven't seen it and you like wine, you must watch it. But there are plenty of there was plenty of Merlot bashing. There was Cabernet Sauvignon bashing too, but there was a lot of Pinot praise. So Pinot had this huge surge in America. It was something ridiculous, like the number of Merlot, the amount of Merlot plantings fell by 25% in the 5 years after Sideways, which was just completely mad. We do still have some amazing ones. I tasted one yesterday, and why is the name escaping me? Hopefully Mahesh might be able to find it. I had a Merlot from, was it Napa yesterday, that Sarah had brought to a tasting. I'm going to try and remember for you now. But that was absolutely incredible. They still exist. They are far less than they used to be. It's a real shame. But there are not just wines that we sell. So Once and Future, I know, sells one. That's not what I tried yesterday, but Once and Future was amazing. We've mentioned already the Wente Livermore Valley. So Wente, who make Chardonnay, make a really brilliant Merlot. Pardon me. Once and Future, they make an unbelievable Sonoma County Merlot that's sort of 50, maybe £45 a bottle, something like that. And I tried one yesterday and the name escapes me. The other great producer that's a bit of an institution is Duckhorn, and we don't sell their wines, but if you are interested, Duckhorn is apparently we've got 5 California Merlots on at the moment. Thank you, Mahesh. Duckhorn wine is a very famous Napa premium wine, and they make a great Merlot as well. So although we don't sell it, I would recommend going to have a look at Duckhorn if you fancy trying some top-notch Cali Merlots, but certainly Once and Future, that would be where I go. They haven't all gone. So John Britton, I'll just try one more final question. Will you be talking about the difference between wines of the USA and, for example, wines of California? Hopefully I've done that. Hopefully I've shown you that California, yes, it's the big chunky meaty bit, the 84%, but there are far more other great producing states. I must confess, I have only tried Washington, Oregon, Michigan, New York, and California. So my options are limited, but I have to say all of those were smashing. So do get out and try more Californian wines, please, 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 and get out and try more wines from the broader USA, because actually there's a lot more to be said. Oh, Mahesh is thinking it might be more about the legal definition. Maybe sorry if I answered that incorrectly, John. If it's the legal definition, wine of California has to be within state, but it has to only be the 85% rule. So you can actually ship grapes from different places and different grape varieties. So if it says wine of California on the label, then you can actually have moved it from out of state, but you wouldn't, because California is such an easy place to grow grapes. I hope that's what you mean. I'm not sure. Anyway, moving on, since Mahesh has said yes, he thinks that's what you mean. Thank you, Mahesh. You're always here to help me, especially when I can't read. So hopefully that's been relatively enlightening. We tried to do one of the largest countries in the world with wine growing of hundreds and hundreds of varieties. So fingers crossed that means that means you've got a little bit more information. If you do want to deep dive into Oregon, Napa, Sonoma, then absolutely I will be doing those on a focus on session. So hopefully you'll join me for those, because I'm really excited. I love the USA. I've traveled around tasting the wines there, and I can't recommend them highly enough. So without further ado, I'm going to enjoy the rest of my Zinfandel. I'm going to see what lovely treat my lovely treat my husband has cooked me. Annoyingly, it's not a barbecue, and now all I want is a burger with my Zinfandel. But hey ho, we can't have it all. Thank you again, Mahesh, behind the scenes this evening. I hope everyone has a lovely rest of the week, and I will hopefully see a few of you next week. I'm in London on the tasting on Tuesday, and then we have tastings online Wednesday, Thursday, and I think Friday as well. So we've got an action-packed week next week. So if I see you then, fantastic. Cheers to one and all, and have a lovely rest of the week. Bye-bye.